So in order to explore how we go from what General Stickland has been outlining into actually developing and enacting our capabilities, I'm delighted to invite members of the final panel for today onto the stage, please. And again, could we give them the customary welcome, please? Just before I hand over to you, Allan, to chair the panel, I just wanted to go through panel members and then just 1 or 2 minutes on the context for what we're going to be exploring. So chairing the panel, as you can see, is Air Marshal Allan Marshal, Air and Space Commander for the Royal Air Force. We have Dr. Sophy Antrobus, the Research Fellow at the Freeman Air and Space Institute. Air Vice Marshal Tom Ashbridge, Director Operations, Defence Digital at UK Strategic Command. Brigadier Matthew Birch, Senior Responsible Owner for Land Intelligence, Surveillance, Target Acquisition and Reconnaissance and Land Information Activities, British Army. Air Commodore Allan Bone, Deputy Commander, UK Space Command. Air Commodore Martin Cunningham, Assistant Chief of Staff Operations, No. 11 Group, Royal Air Force. And Commodore Simon Kelly, Deputy Commander, UK Strike Force, Royal Navy. Before I hand over to you, Allan, the astrographic domain, as General Stickland said. So this is the world above the Kármán line of 100 kilometres. And as we mentioned earlier today, it's a world that's increasingly competed, congested, and contested. And so if we are truly to integrate space into the other domains, what we'll be exploring in this panel is what are going to be those pathways for what we must prioritise. Allan, over to you to lead the session, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure to speak on the topic clearly that's directly associated with my role. I'll just say a few words to open. Unsurprisingly, as I expected, I align quite well with General Charlie, who I've worked with several years. And, the topic will be, yes, the astrographic domain, but also going into not what space can do for the Joint Force, but space as part of the Joint Force very much now as we go forward. And then we'll just rattle through all the members of the panel to get a little bit of a perspective from their service or their area of expertise. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and we can go through some of the themes that General Charlie brought out. But, again, Space Command now sort of just beyond 3 years old. We've achieved quite a lot during that time. Space has been around for a long old time, but actually you feel a real quickening now of interest, involvement and necessity. I think, the Ukraine is just one of the examples that puts that to us. And, that's clearly in the military space, but also in the civilian military space, working with international partners. Our relationships are really strong and growing, and with industry as well. And I think, it's quite new. We're doing it in a way we judge is right for us. The US clearly hugely different in terms of mass. Have got a space force going forward, but most of the other nations are just embarking and growing their space capability now, doing it in slightly different ways. Some do it as part of a joint force. Many nations do it as part of an air force. The majority now, which I really welcome, take personnel from all branches of their service into that force. And I think that's really important. And again, for me, we don't really dither or delay on exactly the construct. It's a bit like the cyber environment as well. It's difficult to get this right and integrate it cross-government in defence. You just choose something and move out. And that's what we're very much doing. And we'll learn as we go and learn as we grow. Just to go into sort of General Charlie themes, it is useful, I think, to describe space as part of the joint force in two aspects. I think there is the aspect where space is a key enabler for others. And as such, the individual services need to be really clear with Space Command what they demand from Space Command, what are their requirements to set our capabilities, therefore to set the demand signal to industry, and also to allow we can configure ourselves down. Allan will speak a little bit more to that going forward. And then there's clearly Space Command operating in the astrographic domain itself, protecting and defending our capabilities, understanding any adversary capabilities, what they can achieve in terms of those missions. And there, Space Command will need help from the Joint Force itself, maybe to protect our ground stations, maybe to disrupt others as well. So again, very much a two-way street, and very much needs to be very, very well integrated going forward. So we'll sort of explore that going through the various panel members. But the first one, I'll just go to Sophy Antrobus just to start with, just so she gives a little bit of the area of her research into looking into setting up new organisations and how you make sure they are integrated in, frankly, what is quite an established defence of 3 domains, which is slowly growing through 5 and potentially further in the future. Sophie.
Thanks, Al. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As any of you who knows me knows, I'm not the space power expert in my household, and I'm the air power one. So it's nice to be asked here, but I'm coming at this from a sort of domain agnostic position, because I think that's what a potentially I can add. My PhD looked at inter-service rivalry about 100 years ago in the 1920s, when the Air Force had been newly created and kicked off a massive argument between the new commands and forces at the time. And although I wouldn't want to say that there's direct comparisons for Space Command for UK space power, I do think it's worth just teasing out a few things, because the arguments were really about the air stepping on the toes of the other services. And those of you who've got, then you all will, I'm sure, almost all of you will, a sort of passing interest in air power over the last few decades, will know that arguments with the Army over close air support and with the Navy over carriers are as old as those services, or as the Royal Air Force is. And actually, yet, and at times, and I'm thinking perhaps as CAS as an example of this, not CAS, sorry, I mean close air support as an example of this, that's an example of where lessons can sort of be learned in the heat of operations and then gradually unlearned until the next time they come around. Now, we had a question actually, which I thought was quite interesting at the last panel, and Warrant Officer Cooper answered it really well, I think, about whether there would be a Space Force in the future in the UK, and perhaps 2035 or longer. And I think we should be comfortable that that's the direction of travel, even if it's not a stated aim at the moment. That's absolutely fine. I think that's okay. But what I really want to challenge the panel on, and what I'm sure you'll bring back in as we go on to the discussion, is it's great we're all here, and there's all the domains represented, and it's great that we're going to have this discussion. And I want to challenge other panel members to identify and predict where the areas of friction are going to be, or are, as well as just saying we really like each other, we're going to work together really well, we all believe in multi-domain operations. Integrated is the word. I've just come back from the Labour Party conference, and on the defence team you never stop hearing them say the word integrated. But I think if we're going to be really honest, and in this panel as well, I'd like to hear examples of where there will be tension at some point in the future, or there won't be. And I'd finish probably by saying that I'll leave that point and maybe come back to it rather than take up any more time. I wanted to finish, those of you, and I know some of you close to space power and in the US as well, will be very aware of the fact that there was a spat in Breaking Defence, which sort of new news organisation online, in August. The Mitchell Institute, which is a Air and Space Power Institute in Washington, D.C., many of you will be familiar. A couple of their people wrote an article, Army wants to own Space Force, they shouldn't be allowed to. And then that prompted another article by a couple of Army officers, one of whom has written an actually excellent paper on domain parochialism. And that was, and so I've got a lot of time for this, the Colonel concerned. Army has a vital role in space and it continues to grow. And General Whiting, who I know is speaking tomorrow, has also spoken out about this. Now, I just think that that's unhelpful. It's going to happen. So that's my starting point, is as we have this discussion, I think all be as honest as possible about not just talking about how great things are going to be, but really where the problems are.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Sophie, for those words. And yeah, I agree. It's something we need to be aware of, discuss openly going forward. I think, again, for the UK at the moment, our breadth of space expertise is quite concentrated into full-on space specialists, as General Charlie said. We are growing. We've got a space academy which is starting up to educate as many people, and that's something that we must strive for: educate as many people with space across UK defence. But for now, at the scale we are at, we are focusing our specialists and our capability within Space Command under General Tedman. But I think as we grow going forward, again, there's a risk that as you get more people vie for attention and priority. So yeah, definitely something to remain alive to throughout, and we can explore as we go through the panel. But Adam, if I can sort of firstly get a little bit of your perspective. So Adam works as the Deputy Commander within Space Command itself. So some reflections from yourself, in particular, how you see it, and what more you would need in terms of a demand signal from the other areas of the Joint Force to make sure you can optimise what you can do.
Thanks, sir. Yeah, so we really like each other, and we're going to work together really well. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and great that I've got my other domain panel members here. I think for me, a few points I'd make, some of which brilliantly were made by CJO, and they've been covered off by a few people today. But I think I'll give you the Space Command kind of viewpoint. Great that this is called the Astrographic region. I think is one of my first points I want to make is space is a geographic area. We know that's here. It isn't just a capability. Quite often it's spoken as such. It's an AOR, an area of responsibility. And for a military commander, that has its own kind of connotations for obvious reasons and implications, which is why these gentlemen and Sophy are so useful in progressing our sort of space domain. It's, as I said, not just an enabler, it is an AOR. Whilst different, I did have written in my notes, whilst different, space is not special. General Charlie has just said space is in the special bracket. It is. What I mean is it doesn't actually run by some of the rules of some of the other sort of domains. And I'll go by that. I'll go through that as well. Like land, I'd say, like maritime, we've got, air commanders here as well. We need not only to support, and General Charlie said it, we need to be supported as well. And I think that's an important thing to consider going forward. What we're really after and have been over the last few years since our formation, really a greater understanding of related dependencies, really, and how we can exploit them together. And as Sophy says, really important to work out where we might not be able to and how we can work together to make that happen. But I will say this, we've moved on considerably in the time, especially the last year, coming here last year and the year before, some of these conferences, we've moved on considerably from where we were before, which is hugely encouraging. In many ways, I often think of this, I was thinking at lunch today, it's in many ways, space is kind of the air, the oxygen that's many of the military other domains kind of breathe. And General Charlie talked about space control, and I think what would our viewpoint if ever that and our oxygen was kind of challenge, our oxygen source. So this is where some of the use of the other domains to protect and defend space is so important. A couple of other things I mentioned. Space is different. My aim in helping General Tedman and before him Air Marshal Godfrey in normalising, if you will, and operationalising the Space Command was always to get into that planning room, be one of the first people in the planning room, or get on an operations schematic. It did happen 2 or 3 years ago. Some of the people will probably be sympathetic towards this. I did go in the odd room we're working with different domains, and they had to go out and get a borrowed chair from next door because somebody had forgotten the space guy was there as well. And I'd be sat on a chair in the corner. But hey, I've slowly moved my way in towards that table. Similarly, seen my name written instead of in the print, it's in biro because people remember the space guy needs to be involved. But that's changed. That's changed now. And I go in, I brief Air Marshal Al every Wednesday morning, and we go in and I'm, the second person there to talk about after some of the air issues. So we're at the front, and it's great that we've kind of been fully accepted into the fold. It is a joint activity. We know all that. We've heard that today. It's a joint force challenge for all of us. And I think, we've heard it several times today. It's not just on orbit. It's to, through, space, ground installations, everything. And this is where all of these kind of players next to me come in. I've got a couple of things written in my notebook in terms of the vision and mission, but the vision for Space Command being, and it was mentioned this morning, competitive Space Command by 2030. I can only do it really when I look down and speak to the and work with the people to my right. I did have some thoughts in my head which I noted down about what each of them kind of can help and provide with space. I think I'll that should come out in discussion as well, because I think each of them will sort of kind of come forward with their view of space. But very quickly, you look at the green of Matt's and you saw the land side of things. Current and future ground-based infrastructure is going to be really important. We'll need supporting. We'll need protection, tracking stations, comms facilities. God forbid, even launch sites. These things will need support. AVM Tom, who've been friends for a long time. From a cyber perspective, really important both for cyber security, which was mentioned a couple of times this morning, but also the huge technological leaps that his and my domains can make together when we work really closely. Simon being here as well, maritime vessels important, being able to provide sort of comms and support, especially in areas of sort of limited terrestrial access, something that's increasingly important for the different areas we work in. And as I've said, Martin and Air Marshal Al, we're quite lucky in Space Command. They're about 250, 300 metres away. It depends how lucky you think you are when your boss is 300 metres away. But it is a good thing. If I need something, I can literally walk across the road. And 11 Group especially have got us involved in everything. We've got a really, really tight relationship with them. So that's getting better and better. The way in which they've supported our Space Warning Squadron, our Space Operations Squadron, and the way those things have stood up. So that's absolutely been fantastic. I think looking further and looking just beyond just these domains very quickly, what an opportunity for us all to do things differently and drive innovation and productivity. What's been really great for me after a quarter of a century in the military is the last 2 years or so in the command, being able to think about something slightly differently on a new domain to a degree with a blank sheet of paper. That's been hugely interesting and rewarding. It was talked about in the last panel, so I don't want to go into it in too much detail. I think for all of us and all of our domains, we need that trained workforce. One of the things that we're expected to do within Space Command is got to look at how we upskill and cohere general space understanding, foundational space understanding throughout space. And also, in my mind, think of a syllabus that moves beyond that to some of the more complicated things, orbital mechanics and beyond, which, I haven't quite got my head around yet, but I will get there. And really think about all of our staff. It came out, defined. I always think about, especially within defence, but not just defence, anywhere else and with industry. You're jumping from lily pad to lily pad to try and find how your career will kind of progress forward. I'm really trying to make sure that everybody, every rank within the command knows that there is an opportunity for them to be within space, or if they hop out for a moment to understand another domain, to hop back in. So something else that we're really thinking about. And I think two more things really before I'm quiet. C2, Air Marshal Allan mentioned it earlier. There's lots of good people here. We're working in many different areas. There needs to be an understanding of who that team captain is for team space. And I think that's important. Something we've really got to work through, and we're very aware of that in Space Command as well. There's discussion about acquisition processes this morning, so I won't go into that. I think we're there. International cooperation. General Whiting being here today. We've had huge steps forward, not just with the US, with our Four Eyes partners, Five Eyes partners. The combined space operations, so going out to a number of different nations, General Trout's here as well. It's just been fantastic. I think that in itself has been fantastic. The bit to mention here is we've had much to do with many of the force elements from those nations as well. So understanding how they're dealing with their domain. And as you look at the way Australia have been working lately and what they've done in their recent defence review, there's much to learn between us all. And given the nature of the domain, the linkages, I think, like I said, with our combined space operations and NATO, NATO's come up a couple of times. Stu Athan mentioned it, and I think that's the way we need to operationalise. Careful with that word, but operationalise space and think about how we do that. The very last thing I'll say, the mission written down in the front of my notebook is the Space Command mission to integrate and assure space effects to the integrating force and to protect and defend the integrated force from space threats. And I think we can only achieve this. I can only achieve this with the help, and I've had lots already, but with the help of everybody here, not just in uniform, but the industry and academia, other elements we've got, many of which are here today. So it's a good start, and I think we're going in the right direction. And that's me, sir.
Brilliant. Hey, thanks, Adam, for that perspective of Space Command. I think, given you highlighted the links with sort of cyber, EM, and digital, Tom, if we're happy, we'll go to you from sort of strategic command perspective and your specialist.
Yeah, thanks. So, so I'm here on that as part of strategic command, but I lead our defensive cyber and EM activities. So very much looking at it as one of those five domains, and indeed, as CJO said, one of the two special domains. So Adam and me are in that club, which is great. I think I start off from a point of real interconnectedness between the cyber and EM domain and the space domain. And that really struck me again today, just coming into the building and just seeing so many kind of colleagues and people I've worked with in my current work and through my career here, also supporting Space Command. So I just think that that interconnected piece really plays through. Clearly, we extend cyberspace over SATCOM, through space. We've been doing that for decades. And equally, most of my awareness from my electromagnetic awareness for operations deployed comes from the space domain. So I'm really dependent on that kind of interconnectivity kind of plays through in spades. And equally, I know Adam and Space Command are hugely dependent on us in terms of the work they do. The kind of cyberspace is at the heart of that. I then think really about threats, and I kind of go back to some of my early career, and think about how we overcame threats to our space-based capabilities. So perhaps some SATCOM that I deployed when I was a junior officer. And we have a long history of overcoming threats and being able to deal with them and find a way of...
Yeah, they've all had very happy.
What I'd say is that those were often technical measures. They were things we could do technically, and they were quite responsive. They were reactive. The enemy or the adversary had first mover advantage, and that tended to mean that there was an impact on the joint force. We might lose communications and then re-establish in a protected mode with some slightly kind of constrained capacity, but still be able to pass key messages and orders, etc. But we could still fight through. So that really sort of shifts to me thinking about what is my demand signal on Space Command, and I see lots of parallels between that world I just described of being kind of quite reactive and quite technically focused to how we've grown up in the cyber domain. So I think of some of my early days of that and kind of computer network defense. We had lots of technical controls, whether it's sheep death, antivirus. And the first thing we did when there was a problem is kind of isolate the network and take everything down and kind of impact on those actually trying to deliver broader joint operations. But we have shifted that. It might not always feel it if you use some of Defence Digital services, but I promise we have kind of shifted our operational mindset. And it's much more about fighting through that environment, anticipating the adversary, and kind of getting ahead of them. So that really is where my kind of first demand on Space Command comes from. And it's that sort of idea of getting ahead of threats. Clearly, I've talked about the interconnectedness. There are things that happen in space or to space assets that are carrying bits of cyberspace. We can't afford in the future to be waiting for those threats to impact and then respond to them. We've got to get ahead. Clearly, that's some work that we can do with Space Command, but it's also an all-team sport, and I think that's come through in CGO's talk. It might be a land-based jammer that's impacting on one of SAI's maritime deployments, so we kind of need to come together, understand that threat, and really get ahead of it, and try and impose some cost back on the adversary to make it more difficult, and we can do that better as a joint effort. I think the second point that links to that is really about resilience. So starting to think about, again, as a kind of two-way street, about how my extensions of cyberspace through space can be more resilient. There's lots of new technologies, diversification of platforms, orbits, there's frequencies. There are things we can do today and are doing, both for ourselves and in support of partners elsewhere, that are really increasing the kind of resilience that I'm able to provide from a cyber mission assurance perspective. That goes the other way as well in terms of cybersecurity and my defensive cyber operations. How am I protecting Adam's key terrain and making sure his operations can kind of progress? And I think my kind of final demand signal is really about the development of the domain, and it really struck me listening to this more how much of the journey, whether that is how do we integrate a new domain that is geographically different to the physical domains, how do we develop skills, technical skills, and incentivize those in a workforce that wants different things to I did when I joined about a quarter of a century ago. There are so many shared parallels there. that I think we really need to collaborate on our development of those domain operations together, such that we can learn from each other. I don't think any of us have got all of the right answers, but we will learn, and we will learn by, as Marshal Al said, picking something, moving out and learning. But if we're both doing that and learning from each other, then we'll go twice as far. That applies nationally, but I think it also applies in spades with partners. And I think there is a real beauty of the UK as the sort of size and capacity that we are. It's kind of a Goldilocks kind of size where we're not too big, in terms of some of the challenge that I see with my US colleagues kind of joining up what their space and cyber people are thinking. But we're big enough to have that kind of, decent capability. So I think there's something there, as well as partnering nationally, where we can really partner internationally to help allies and NATO, because we can see what each other are doing. I will touch on Sophie's challenge about friction. So I think we have both grown up our organisations in kind of brownfield sites. So I think particularly where we are extending cyberspace through space, there are going to be challenges over authorities, who's in charge, who gets to make the decision. Is a threat to a space asset more or less important than a threat in cyberspace? I think we are now getting towards having the right constructs to work those through as part of the joint force working with CFO to CJO to integrate that. But I still think there will be challenges as we go on that journey.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I agree. And again, actually thinking about that point, again, and also for cyber and space as well, there's other government equities involved as well. So often it's not just purely within the Department of Defence. We do need to go to our Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and I'm sure other nations need to go to their equivalents as well. And we'll work through that as they go forward. But thank you, Tom. We'll get to sort of the three traditional single service perspectives now. So Simon, do you want to give us a Navy view?
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I thought what I'd do is I'd break down, and perhaps it's sort of a slightly lower level, what we in the maritime, where we feel space has become increasingly integrated in day-to-day operations. And you can, if you'd like, you can judge me on the baseline of that and maybe draw an analogy from it. I don't know. But so if I sort of traced mine, again, I'm going to say quarter of a century of career, the three areas that we need: precise navigation and timing, I'll wrap them up into one. Communications, and I don't just mean voice to voice. I mean communications between a close-in task group to a disaggregated task group, and not just the voice comms, but sharing a picture, a maritime, air, land, cyber and space picture, so our understanding as a group, and clearly communications back and outwards in terms of data. And then finally, ISTAR. So how do we understand what's out there? How do we increasingly use space to build a precise picture that we can target off? And if I look at 25 years, I think about when I started off at sea, where indeed it really is a sextant, and we still teach those traditional methods. And everything we did was either visual, or we were exploiting the electromagnetic spectrum in order to understand what are they emitting, what is our radar bouncing off, how do we build our picture of what is around us. And what we saw is that those traditional methods grow to where I'd say defence systems, space-based systems had a monopoly. And we saw, for example, GPS become increasingly precise. Now into a realm where commercial has the lead on many of these things. What does that mean to us? It's a massive transformation, and it presents massive operational advantage and a system of systems. But the really important thing, particularly from the maritime, is we don't operate as single ships. A single ship is a system of systems in the same way that our homes are systems of systems. But the task group is a system of system. The C2 is a systems and system. And the precise navigation, the timing of how that weapon arrives on that target or how you have an effect is all tied together in space. So if it's that critical to us, that then presents us with making sure we understand where our vulnerabilities and dependencies are. And particularly our focus is on understanding where we are in a command and control degraded environment, how we continue operations in that environment. And I'd say it's finding a balance. So sometimes the pendulum swings a little bit too far. What we need to make sure is that we keep hold of our ability to do things with the basics, but we integrate with choice, with the capabilities of that space and that operational advantage that space gives us. And so we always have an alternative, a secondary, and a reversionary mode. And particularly when it comes to integrating new technology, how do we make the demand signal on our customers to ensure that everything we have is as resilient as possible? So what that sort of then comes into, what do I ask of Space Command? What do I want? Well, ideally, I want assured access. I want to understand my adversary. I want to understand their capabilities and where we can exploit those capabilities. But I really want to understand my vulnerabilities and help with them to build it and to mitigate for those. I certainly want them to adopt the most cutting edge and most innovative solutions to the problems we've got. How can we mitigate? What comms methods can we use, for example, to go reversionary when certain elements are withdrawn from us? And how do we amplify the maritime effect from space? And how do we amplify space effect from the maritime? How can we use naval strike to strike at a ground station? Where do we see that symbiosis on both sides? I certainly want often these capabilities, and I know with cyber certainly, sovereign capabilities are naturally incredibly sensitive, and so I'm going to seek cyber space to unlock and unpick some of those sovereign capabilities from allies and partners to work in through the alliances that we sit within in NATO to ensure that we've always got those services. And then it's a bit trite, but we need to learn. We need to do it together. We need to make sure that we are educating so that everybody speaks the language from the day they walk through the door at Raleigh or at Dartmouth all the way through. From a command level, we've got to understand policy, permissions, ROE, and the complexities of that. And that's where I probably throw in some of the frictions. There is always going to be friction there, and you beat me to the punch with it. But I would say actually the friction comes through layers of command rather than necessarily between services, because we will always be screaming for the authorities and permissions to use a capability, and we will undoubtedly find ourselves frustrated because it's not the right time or the right place. But that goes for anything. LOs, so liaison officers. So our Operational Advantage Centre down in Portsmouth, we have 2 from Space Command. We recently deployed as a 2-star headquarters to US synthetic training in Norfolk, Virginia, against the sort of the cutting edge warfighting challenges. And the 2 first names on the team sheet were from Space and Cyber. And what was interesting is I couldn't work out whether we'd over adjusted for both of them because they were often the first that spoke. But certainly every single meeting I went to, the 2 individuals were every single meeting talking at every level, from my boss all the way down to the most junior levels, because everything seemed to have that implication, and particularly where you go up against the most capable opponent, where they're matching you like for like in terms of persistent surveillance and their ability to try and degrade your ability to operate. So it's a dialogue. It's understanding capabilities, vulnerabilities, and how to exploit it with the enemy.
Thanks, Allan. Which is good. Matthew.
Cool.
Land perspective, please.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I think from a land perspective, I think probably the first thing I need to do is turn around and say, I don't believe we've got any plans for Space Army, so we can put that to bed straight away. But I think our sort of demands are very similar to what you've heard from the maritime perspective. It's PNT. We absolutely rely on particularly sort of surveying techniques from space to ensure that not only our munitions fly in the right directions, but also that we know where we are on the ground, know what our start points are. And it's a capability for old-fashioned survey that we've traded away pretty much now. And therefore we have a very strong reliance on that. Equally, communications, and it's the networking of capabilities that we need to put together, dispersed forces over over distinct distances that are absolutely enabled by space communications. And space ISR, we're looking at the same things. But I think that will probably be one of my first real demand signals is when we talk about ISR, the NATO terminology for what we do. But actually, normally in the land environment, we talk about I-STAR. So we have target acquisition in the middle of that. And why is that important? Because actually what I don't need is information about the enemy that's 12, 24 hours old. I need something that's current. If I'm conducting combat engagement, we need to know what, with very low latency, what is going on the battlefield. So you might turn around and say that that's not actually a challenge for space-based ISR technology. It's the bearer systems we use, and I would absolutely accept that. But between us, we need to start working that we can actually talk to each other at the speed of relevance that we need, and making sure that the information flow that's coming down from those space-based assets are enough for us to be able to target effectively and give all the information that we'd need for the latest types of weapon systems so that we can actually exploit them fully. And I think that's the first key part of the demand signal. But I would really note that within the land environment, our consciousness is changing. I'm not sure I would say directly because of integrating the space component in, but as we've talked about multi-domain integration and multi-domain operations, that has absolutely been a driver through in how we've conducted ourselves in the land environment. A lot of the training nowadays takes into the factors from all 5 domains and trying to replicate those factors in training. And I know from my own experience, having left the ARC, our core headquarters, last summer, there was always space-based activity involved with every one of our exercises, and we made sure that we played through what the implications were of that. So it is definitely being talked about. We are trying to learn the lessons, but I sense that there is still further that we need to go. The education that we've got is a sprinkling of education. It's not starting at the lowest level private and going to the most senior general in the army. We are starting to get an understanding, but we don't quite have the depth of where we need to go at the moment. And it is, and listening to the analogy of being brought into the planning tent and having a place at the table, I think we're sort of, within land planning, we are going through that process as well of integrating in the space domain, and we're getting that more front and center. As part of that, we have been establishing space-based or space-facing roles within the Army headquarters, particularly in the futures area, where we're looking at really integrating the capability in amongst everything else that we do within the land environment, but also in the LOC, the Land Operating Centre, effectively our component headquarters. We have the space-based LO in there to allow that interaction going forward. But I do think that we need more formalised input into our high-level deployed headquarters so that we actually continue to get that golden thread of thinking about space throughout all of them. What is interesting, though, is that the conversation, I would say, from my perspective within the land environment, is probably not so much about how we can be exploiting space technology, but a realisation of actually how dependent we are on space capabilities, and how do we survive if that is denied to us. So I suppose the second ask is actually, what we really need is significant resilience within the space domain so that we can actually continue to receive the support that we absolutely rely on. And then I think the final part within this, and it almost comes back to that sort of targeting point before, is probably assistance from the space domain in how we really fight the space ground infrastructure. We've talked about it, and I can think about satellite dishes or anything else, but I think within the land environment, we've really got to understand of how do we break it up in the same way as we've done the same activity as for A2AD, anti-access aerial denial capabilities. What's the same of breaking down the adversary space system? How is the most effective way to do that? Are we striking the power stations? All different ways rather than necessarily going directly for their space capability. Therefore, integrating that into our planning probably becomes absolutely important. And then finally, much like the others, we need to know where our place is in getting prioritisation of support. How much support can we get from the space component? To what degree is it guaranteed so that we can conduct our planning? Thank you.
That's really good. Finally, over to Marshal. I'm sure most of the sandwiches have been stolen. Any reflections before we go into questions, Martin?
So
So thank you very much. Yeah, all my sandwiches have been stolen because I think we've all read the second executive guide on space. Really, I'm thinking from the air component perspective as to where we sit at the moment. Adam waxed lyrically at the start. We have a really close relationship with space. That's not because my office to his office has got to cost us coffee in between. It's purely because the fact is that having space at the table. I've been in this job now for 6 months as the Assistant Chief of Staff Operations. Is that I've been blown away at how space has developed in the 3 years that I've been away from the air component in a NATO role. And the advantage that it brings to bear is phenomenal. And we see these effects on a daily basis. We also see the phenomenal dependency on the space domain. And so it links back really to the education of our people. So my team, we've got a whole mix, some really young, vibrant, cool kids that are just, their thirst for knowledge and their understanding of the space domain is really impressive. I have some other people like ourselves up here whose thirst for knowledge is equal and often a little bit befuddled as to how that came about. The compartment issue is a real issue from an operator's perspective because, I mean, a bit like fifth generation, I don't need to know how it does it. I just need to know what it can do for me so that I can generate the operational tempo and the advantage. We've got some very exquisite, phenomenal capabilities. We've also got some very some dated equipments, but that space really helps us stitch that all together and try to, and obviously our focus is to generate the operational advantage. Information is key to me. I mean, from an air component perspective, is that I've got to know what's going on. I've got to be able to communicate and command and control. Recently, we've just done a big exercise, Agile Shield, where we did our own ACE exercise within. One of the scenarios was to start denying the command and control systems away from how we do our business. It was really telling to see how quickly we had become dependent on those. It was really good because some of the more senior experience in the room were able to default back to traditional methods. Some of the new approaches some of the new guys on the block didn't have that experience. So at the moment, I'm stitching those two elements together so that to be a resilient force. I hope there isn't going to be a space army. And what Sophy, hopefully, having read the executive summary of their PhD, is that we've got an opportunity now as we kick off in the space domain. If we as components get into a fight over this, then we have lost from the very get-go. We don't need, and it comes back into the compartments that space often sits in because of where it comes from. Is that we don't need to get into those conversations now. What we need to do is exploit, and drive forward together because we are hugely complementary as in our capabilities as we go forward. My final bit really is on NATO. My previous role to this was working within NATO for 2 years. And the NATO space domain or element, as they are growing, and they are growing at a huge rate, a huge pace. It's very difficult within NATO because they don't own anything in that domain. So very much in the EM spectrum and in the cyber domain where you've got the SCEPFA type approach, nations have got to get on board with assisting and working and getting a lot of those clearances and the ability to be able to transfer information very quickly into NATO, because that is where we will all end up. We will start off in bilats, trilats, multilats, but we will all end up, when we're fighting at high-end warfare, we will end up in the NATO space. And that is where we've got to be comfortable and not having to ask ourselves the questions at the very start. We come back to where Adam was, the space always has to be at the table, whether that's our own conventional, our bilateral relationships, or our multilateral and into NATO. So that's from me, that's from an ACOS Ops perspective, where I've got to get my force, my team comfortable to be able to deliver operational effect. That's me, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's good, and thanks to all the panels for sharing that. And again, I think Matthew on prioritisation. Again, we're quite clear. General Charlie, who sort of spoke before us, in terms of the space contribution, on a day-to-day operational basis. Yeah, it's the Chief of Joint Ops will be prioritising. Won't get to that, and I hope that real clarity putting space as a component under CGO will hopefully at least take out at least the first veneer of friction, if any more comes over time. But thank you. Anna, are you going to do questions, or do you want me to do them directly?
I can pilot up from here, but what I'll do is I'll fill the room.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, yes, good.
Wanted to do, and then you asked them to do this hour to bring us up. I've stripped 2 pages.
All these. I think the key takeaways I have from here come into 4 areas. One, when you look at the 3 classic sort of areas of main prioritization with PNT, comms, and space, ISR, but then target acquisition as well. What's coming through very, very clearly is the desire to be able to have resilience and operate in a degraded environment, looking at the absolute criticality of these now and the transformation that's happened. That's number one. Number two, what's been alluded to a number of times, and especially right at the end, is the international perspective, being able to learn from other nations for the journey they've gone, but then looking at that NATO prioritization, the cross-domain and cross-service support to be able to support each other. And I would weave that in with the point that Sophy brought up at the beginning, which has sort of gone through all the way. The reality is there is a change of culture needed, not at an overall scale, but at an individual scale. And how do we facilitate that better? So having said that as my 1-minute summary, we have got about 13 minutes for questions. So I'll pick some, fire them to you, Alan, and then you can sort of disperse them as you see fit. Question from Tom Weatherhead from 1st Space Operations Squadron. The speakers have talked about fighting in a world where we are denied access to space. What about a world where we're fully defeated in space and our adversaries have freedom of action? So it's controversial, but we look at the threat landscape that we're under. Should space therefore be thought of as our primary warfighting domain? Over to you, Alan.
Yeah, I think I might have a bit of a crack at answering. So, I think I hope we're not in the situation that, the UK and its allies are defeated in space, yet the adversary has freedoms in space. And that's what we're all working together to avoid. I think more realistic is a situation where space is denied to a degree, if not a significant degree, to all, due to debris or bad behaviours or worse in space. So, for me, I think that is what we really need to focus on. And I think it came out a little bit because of some of the old sweats, whether it's sextants or using emergency communications. I do think we need to be clear, especially this early part in the journey where I think it's really difficult to assure continued access. We both practice our resilient reversionary methods a day without space. You probably need ISR in other environments as well as space. And then you start to get into some of the really interesting topics about maybe reactive launch in order to exploit the areas of space that remain available going forward. And clearly, that we'd love to be in there. We'd love to have the capability to do that. Resilience in space and to react in space. So that would be my take on that. Adam, any more? I'll just go to you with this one.
Thanks, sir. It's always good to be asked a question by a colleague. So, well, I think any.
Does it work for you? He works.
It does, yeah.
Great.
Not for much longer.
Yes. Thank you. So, depending on the conflict, any particular domain will have primacy. So, I think that it's very dangerous putting one before the other in any particular circumstance. I think that's the whole purpose of this panel, is to say, okay, even with a defeated space domain, as I've said, I can use land, I can use maritime to affect an opposition's space capability. Bearing in mind, we're not just talking again about on-orbit warfare or anything like that, to and from space. So connectivity, Tom's down there to deal with cyberspace sides of things. We can also look at ground-based facilities, and this is where I look to my land and maritime colleagues as well. So I'd say it's a very dangerous thing to suggest that one domain should have primacy over the other. And that this is the whole purpose of this discussion, is to say whatever we're confronted with, we can fight back or counter what's presented to us.
And our approach normally is, depending on the stage of the conflict or even the hour of a day, a different environment might take primacy and be supported by others, and we need to retain our agility to do that. Back to you, Andy.
Yeah. Sophie talked about change. I've got 2 questions which are related to change. So what I'll do is I'll field them both, and you can sort of take your pick or do both. The first one is from Nick Myrick, or Mayrick, apologies if I'm not correct on the pronunciation. We've heard a lot about what space can or is providing to the Joint Force, but I'd be interested to hear the panel's view as to what capabilities they would wish to come from space that they are not yet receiving, and I'll parallel that with, so what can't we have that you want? I'll parallel that with a question from Ashana Sadaf, which is, what technological advancements are necessary to support effective joint space operations in the face of evolving threats? So what do you want that you haven't got yet from the space domain, and what technological advancements do we need, either in terms of what you need now or what you can see as achievable?
Cool. In a second, I'm going to pick on land to have a quick thing. I'm not respond about that, but again, right now, as sort of the aerospace commander trying to provide through Adam and General Tedman, casuals, what we don't have now actually is mass and capacity, and as yet, ability to do space control is pretty minimal. So I think, and we may hear later in the day or tomorrow about that, but I think for our ability to protect and defend is not yet where it would wish to be. And I think we would put some investment in that. And in addition, I think, again, making absolutely assured robust connectivity to space to the greatest extent possible would be where I go. But yeah, I think, increased space control capability is my vote. Land, I chose you just to
Thank you, sir.
Any thoughts?
I'm not sat here thinking that there's a completely novel capability that we need. I think my view on mass, though, is probably, particularly when we think about communications, is making sure that we have the bandwidth we require, and that's going to be an insatiable demand. And we look in civilian life, we've just got 5G, but suddenly that's not good enough. We'll be moving to 6G next. There will be a continual demand for that. So it's not just mass for survivability and resilience, but it's mass so that we can actually improve our data connectivity that we have and conduct that networking capabilities. And then I think it's probably beyond that is, as we talk about ISR, it's the range of sensors, the capability of those sensors. That's where we would probably look at the technology developing, getting that granularity that everyone needs, so that we can get the best information possible in that timely fashion.
Works for me, Matthew. Thank you. And I back to you.
So we were talking about inter-domain or tri-service support and sort of capabilities development. So a question from Andy Challen, sort of going beyond this, is, are mechanisms in place to integrate commercial capability quickly if the UK threat level increases, as Ukraine have? So going beyond that direct support, or?
Yeah, I think, coming into the role, I'm already surprised and actually impressed by the amount of commercial capability we leverage going forward. And, we've got a lot of nations work together to really maximise the data we can get from commercial sources. So I think actually the baseline of use of commercial information, particularly in terms of a level of space domain awareness and a level of ISR support, is probably a little bit above where we think we do. I think, again, can't talk about it too much in this forum, but we have done a level of activity in Ukraine, some, software moving forward pretty quickly, but I'm under no illusion that we are a public sector organisation with procurement checks and balance for, to make sure we're spending public sector money appropriately, that we've got to challenge ourselves all the time to do this. So I think if I was to honestly answer the question, have we got it optimized and perfect? No. And I think as we go through the journey, we need to challenge ourselves and get others to help us through commercial process, through competitive process to get it there. So, but I don't think that's unique to space. I think that is an issue that we are learning in terms of rapid capability acquisition and adaptation. That is just a reality of the modern world in all environments. Any more for the panel or for that?
I'd only say to add to that, because I'm just your last point is completely valid. This is a challenge across the domains. Is that I think the Strategic Defence Review is very focused on that issue, and then following on Defence Industrial Strategy, there are views on how that should work. But it's in all the discussions I'm having about it, that is such a live element of the SDG.
And I think it was notable with the new government coming in that acquisition reform was a really, really early sort of priority for them.
So then looking at that commercial responsiveness question that Andy opened up with, I had a follow-on from Jason, no surname. Panel 2 gave an industry perspective on trust. So what would you like to see industry do to build your trust? So if we're looking to broaden our capabilities but going outside into industry.
Yeah, I think quite a difficult one. And again, nothing particularly useful space. I think really transparent, open dialogue is obviously there. It's on us to make sure we're as clear as we can be with our requirements, and it's on us to be as really clear as we can be with what is an aspiration and what is like to have the confidence of funding going forward. I think again, my reflection would be that we need honest statements from industry, about what is deliverable, what the technical readiness level of capabilities are. So rather than things as sort of, a punt or a proposition, we really understand how mature, how tested some of those capabilities are. That would be my instinctive answer. But anything else?
On that end, from a procurement perspective, I think one of the big changes has happened, and I would absolutely reflect, this isn't a space question, it's a more general MOD procurement question. But I think the fact that we now have more agile contracting and therefore developing partnerships is absolutely to our advantage. And definitely in my areas, I know from an ISTAR capability area, where we have those ongoing relationships over multiple years, where we have innovation cycles baked in with industry, we're exploiting that flexibility that agile contracting gives us. It actually is building in the mechanisms now so that should we go on operations, we can exploit that even quicker, and we can then put more financial resource into it and get that change delivered more quickly. Because at the moment, we're still constrained by policy issues, safety issues, other concerns that actually if we were going on operations, if we're warfighting, they can be stripped away. But what we've got in there critically is that relationship with industry. So I would say to industry, it's the depth of your knowledge, your partnership with us, and your positive behaviours that are the key things that we should be looking at.
Yeah, I think. You talking? Should we see if we can fit in one more?
Yeah, one more. So this is one of the ones where you've briefly you've got a choice to make, which is a question from Tom Barton James to each of you. What needs a capability jump more? PNT, SATCOMs, or ISTAR? So looking operationally at the performance you get, but the limitations and what you like more.
For me, I think, resilient PNT, I think, is foundational to quite a lot that we do.
Yes, I'm exactly the same. That's where we'd have to start. If we only got those three, it would have to be resilient PNT.
I'd like to come up with something different, but I've got to agree. It's the network of network. If you can't continue to weave that together, especially as you go forward in adopting new technology. Yep.
I'm going to say communications then, just to be slightly different. But I do think that actually communications underpins so much of what we do. If we have the inability to speak to each other, it doesn't matter how good your space ISTAR capability is. If it can't be communicated, it's not going to work.
So for me, it's PNT as well, because it is just foundational to everything we do, but and also our kind of land-based cyberspace systems as well. But just that does not have to come from space. Space, the global nature of the constellation we've got is it is an amazing capability, but we just need to think broader when we answer these questions and make sure we just don't come up with a single domain solution.
I'm going to say a bit of both, all three. Because it's always nice to be wrong. No, on the PNT side of the house, I mean, the air component, we are utterly dependent on a lot of on a huge amount of the PNT for our really high-end platforms and our low-end platforms and the weapon systems in between. So, but for me, from an operations perspective, ISR, more and more ISR, where I can get more operational information advantage so I can do the most effective planning and targeting. That for me is absolutely crucial, but the other two have to come first.
Well, not sure it's my area of expertise really to answer. I suppose I'd only reflect on my experiences as a embedded officer on carriers as an air officer. We needed to know where we were, and we weren't very good at it sometimes. So my experiences have been that I would probably say P&T as well. And I just thought that was a really lovely panel in terms of you trying to take up the challenge of thinking about where there are frictions, I think. And I think I just wanted to finish on that because of what I've just said about my time at carriers. LOs, absolutely, up and down. And history shows that in the 1920s, where there were very good LOs, then there weren't problems.
Good.
History.
Thank you, Sophie.
Good.
Alan,
Over
over to you for final thoughts as we wrap.
Yeah, no, hey, I think we're out of time. So, hey, thank you to all the panel, and thank you to those questions. Hopefully, we teased you through a few useful topics there. And again, this area, like the other domains, is somewhere we really need to challenge our procurement processes and our agility. So, I won't delay too much time, but hopefully, we'll get a chance to discuss with those that wish to later on this evening. But again, please come and find us if you want to discuss any of those topics further later on in the day. But Annie, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, everyone. Colleagues, can we show our appreciation? Thank you very much, everyone.